The African National Congress is meeting to pick a leader, but South Africa's ruling party has been weakened by internal divisions and allegations of corruption. So can the ANC regain its ground, and how so? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Daddy Nabugeda. South Africa's ruling African National Congress Party is in Bloemfontein, the city where it was founded 100 years ago to select a new leader. And the Congress is being seen as an opportunity for the ANC to dispel accusations of corruption and infighting. Well, the current head of the ANC and president, Jacob Zuma, is being challenged by his deputy, Galema Motlanthe. Well, let's just take a look at the controversial leader of the African National Congress. Well, Jacob Zuma came to power at the last ANC conference in 2007 when he ran against and defeated then-President Thabo Mbeki. Zuma's populist persona differed from Mbeki's more remote and academic style. Zuma styled himself a champion of the poor, and his supporters called him the people's president. But he's been criticized for his failure to fix South Africa's faltering economy, and he's been plagued by allegations of corruption. He's said to have used public money to pay for $1 million renovation of his home. Critics also say his family has profited from his position. And the family friend also accused Zuma of raping her, but he was acquitted of that charge in 2006. So can the African National Congress solve South Africa's problems? To discuss this, we're joined by our guests from Bloemfontein, Keith Khoza. He's head of communications for the African National Congress. In Johannesburg, Mmusi Maimane, who is the spokesman for the Democratic Alliance opposition party. And over in London, Martin Plaut, a fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. And Martin is an expert on South Africa, the Horn, as well as Sudan. It's good to have you all with us on this edition of Inside Story. If I can come over to you first, Keith, over in Bloemfontein. Now, with all these allegations that I was just reading out against Jacob Zuma, does he have the credibility to lead the ANC going forward and by extension be the president of South Africa for another 7 years?
Yeah, maybe what we need to say on that issue, he has been on record, the president has clarified this matter over time, that when he started building his homestead in Anc, he was still an MEC in the KZN. He was not a president. So he built a homestead that is designed in the traditional way, where you have a main house and you build other houses.
Right, but there are other allegations against him.
The main house.
There are other allegations against him, some of which are corruption, some of which are that he's failed to fix South Africa's economy. So having said all that, does he have the credibility going forward to lead the ANC should he win?
Can I just explain the Nkanja one? That the president built his house. The only thing that has come to question has been whether the work that was done for security purposes, is it justifiable or not? And those decisions were not made by him as the president, but they were made by government in terms of trying to secure his residence, because he does spend some time in his residence. That was done in line with public policies. There is now an investigation to look at whether the figure or the amount that was spent, was it justifiable or not? And that matter is still under investigation. That does not reflect on the president, and therefore, as to whether he's capable of leading the ANC and the country or not, does not come into question when you look at that matter.
Martin,
the outcome of that investigation will indicate if there was any wrongdoing, who was responsible for it.
Martin, let me get your thoughts on the same question to you and your response to what Keith is saying.
Well, I think the real problem is summed up perfectly by Archbishop Tutu, who has been the moral conscience of South Africa since Nelson Mandela has, in a sense, gone into retirement. And he basically said, I've never been closer to tears than over this issue. How can you have more than 200 million rand spent in this way and people just turn around and say, what the heck, it's fine. And, Jacob Zuma has had 700 different allegations of corruption hanging over him for nearly a decade now, over the arms deal that he was allegedly had a part in. He's never allowed this to come to court. He's fought tooth and nail for this ever to be heard in the court. At the same time, he says, well, I've never been found guilty. Well, of course, he's never been found guilty, and he's tried very hard to make sure that he's never in court.
Mmusi, if Jacob Zuma, in fact, is to win, is the victory genuinely support for Zuma within the ANC, or is it just simply status quo, in your opinion?
Well, I'm not perhaps best equipped to speak on behalf of the ANC, but it is a significant challenge to say that there does seem to be a sense of protection when it comes to the president. We've certainly gone on an extreme question to ask where the public funds have been spent.
Right.
And equally so, second to the constitutional ruling that gave us the right to gain access to the tapes that originally dropped the case against the president then, we are still asking the same question. And after the ruling, the president has refused to issue those tapes.
Right, but let me just bring you back.
Ultimately, overall, as a South African society.
Let me just bring you back for a second to the ANC, and we'll make it very clear that, in fact, I am not asking you to speak on behalf of the ANC. But in your opinion, how much support does Jacob Zuma have within his own party?
Well, I think he certainly does hold a lot. We've seen the nomination process take place, and on the basis of the nominations, and perhaps maybe Keith Khoza will comment on that, but the nominations seem to indicate the fact that the president, or the current president of the ANC, enjoys a strong support within the ANC.
And Keith, what are the implications if Jacob Zuma is not re-elected, and where does his biggest threat come from? Is it within the ANC itself? Because we know that his deputy president, Motlanthe, is hoping for a victory. What are his chances?
Well, if you look at the nationally at the provincial nomination conferences that took place, President Zuma is leading in terms of numbers and in terms of the number of provinces that support him. If those are anything to go by, he will win the elections hands down.
Martin, how different would a leadership be if we in fact see his deputy win, if that were to happen?
Well, of course, Mr. Motlanthe has led the country for a short period in the interregnum between Mr. Mbeki and Mr. Zuma. So he is something of a known quantity. He's actually a pretty good leader, and he's seen as very calm, very quiet. He's worked very well with Mr. Zuma. I don't think he has much of a chance of winning. And what's more likely is you're going to have someone like Cyril Ramaphosa, who's a major business leader, a former National Union of Mine Workers leader, that he will come in as Mr. Zuma's new deputy. I think that will be the really interesting change in the leadership at the top of the ANC, and we'll see what that does to reconstructing the ANC, because there's one thing that is absolutely clear. Until now, we've in a sense had the old guard, the exiles, running the ANC. With Mr. Ramaphosa maybe coming in, that will bring a new breath of life, because he's one of the people who grew up inside South Africa during the fight against apartheid.
Martin, the ANC is trying to shake off these allegations of corruption as well as infighting. Just shed some light on the organization itself. How strong is it today? Is it at a crossroads at all?
I think it is at a crossroads. It is something of a hollow shell. You know, it has something like 1.2 million members. That's what it claims, many more than it's ever had in the past. But it is basically hemorrhaging support at the grassroots, and that is the biggest problem that the ANC faces now. What to do with ordinary people who are basically becoming fed up that they're not getting the services that they've promised. One should also not forget that something like 40 people inside the ANC have been killed in KwaZulu-Natal alone since 2010. This is in fights over party positions, because if you get a key party position, you can then go on and win tenders in government services, and you then make money out of this. And this is really the origin of corruption, and the origin really of the weakness of the ANC as a whole.
Keith, what is your response to that?
Well, let me put the issue into perspective. The ANC is not as divided as people project it. There are people in the ANC who hold different opinions on many issues, and they articulate them differently. And as a result of that, there are different preferences as to who should lead the ANC. And that's why we subject that to a democratic process for the leadership to be elected. But also there are issues that keep coming up. The issues of corruption against Zuma and him refusing to go to court are unfounded. Remember, the case against Zuma on the arms deal was withdrawn in court because it was already in court. But secondly, in just last year, he instituted a commission of inquiry into the arms deal and gave it more powers to even summon anybody, including the president, in the process of that investigation. The idea being that let the truth come out, and the president says he will be vindicated. There are a number of allegations. He went to court on a rape charge, which the court threw out because the court was convinced that it was not true.
Right, but
and
let's just focus on the ANC as a party. Let's just focus. I'd like to keep the discussion on the ANC as a party. And Mmusi, I will come over to you in just a second. But Keith, will there be a real change for these many South Africans that say they've seen nothing good happen to them since the ANC and since Jacob Zuma came to power? What will be different going forward this time around?
No, there's been changes in South Africa. If you look at the latest report, whether it's from private sector, studies that were conducted, the Human Science Research Council, and as well as the Stats SA report, findings now recently, they indicate that there's been a huge improvement in the social life of South Africans.
I'm looking at a report right now which in fact says South Africa, I'm looking at a report right now which has South Africa is considered one of the most unequal societies in the world, and the gap between rich and poor is in fact growing. But let me just cross over to Mmusi for a second. Mmusi, there is the argument that President Jacob Zuma should be given a chance to correct some of his mistakes. What do you think of that?
I think our own political party in Parliament recently put a motion of no confidence in President Jacob Zuma for the exact reasons that some of them you've just cited. We live in a society that's the most unequal in the world. Our levels of poverty have deepened. We have a heightened number of unemployment. And even as the president today opened the Congress, one of the things that have become quite clear is that 18 years under an ANC rule, certainly in the last number of years, have done very little to try and address some of the challenges that we speak about globally. We've sunk on the basis of education. We're seeing our students producing poor results progressively. We are equally so seeing the fact that our output economically is seeing very poor. So to continue along the same trajectory, quite frankly, South Africa cannot afford another term of office of President Jacob Zuma.
All right, but let's just talk about your party then for a second, the Democratic Alliance, because it is in fact mistrusted in the black community itself, and specifically the perception that your party represents the interests of privileged whites in South Africa.
Well, I think that's very unfortunate when you consider the fact that we're in government in one of the provinces here in this country. And so I'll allow the testimony of that to speak for itself. In fact, the schools that have outperformed many schools in the Western Cape come from black communities. In fact, our growth as a party has been, we are the only party in this country that is growing. The ANC has seen a shrinkage in terms of its own election outputs. We are growing. When you look at by-elections in communities that are completely black, we've seen increases of sometimes up to 15-20%. Indicating the fact that South Africans are starting to say there is an alternative and it's credible. When you look at our investment portfolio in terms of black communities, you can begin to identify that we've put significant infrastructure in black communities. In fact, it was a report by an ANC-led government in the cooperative COGTA, which is the cooperative governance and traditional affairs, which said that in terms of access to basic services, the Western Cape is top of that. In terms of education, it is top of that. So the fundamental question we must ask at this stage is, what does South Africa need? And the critical issues are policy certainty, the employment rates are beginning to decrease, as we're proving in the Western Cape, and equally so the delivery of basic service, which has become a brand that the Democratic Alliance lives on. So
Martin,
the
I'd
argument
like you to
is becoming one that is dissipating progressively.
All right, well, I'd like Martin to weigh in on the Democratic Alliance and its support base.
I think that you're right to point out that they have certainly in the past been seen as a white party and as a white-run party. Helen Zille, who's the leader of the party, has gone a long way to try and redress that. She's tried to bring black leadership into the positions of power in the Democratic Alliance, but it's got a long way to go. Maybe they'll win 1 or 2 more provinces next time round. I don't think they'll win the next general election. But, let me just ask Mmusi one question. Why is it that you won't publish your sources of finance? Now, the ANC has never published it, but why don't you set an example of showing where you get your money from? Because that would reassure a lot of South Africans.
Well, to put that point up front, it is clear that national government does a disbursement of funds to political parties on the basis of the proportion of election results. So we've never hidden that fact. But consider a South African who perhaps believes in democracy in a country that has a historical legacy that was so deeply rooted in apartheid, where perhaps maybe funding a particular political regime would be seen as unfair or compromising to their prospects in this country. Should we be allowed as a political party to compromise them while they're doing a very noble thing by funding the processes that go with it? So we have never hidden the fact that we have a report. We have never hidden the fact that we refuse to reveal, as has the ANC, say who our funders are, but we've become very clear that if you audit any of our government processes, you will discover that a level of corruption in our governments where we govern is significant, in fact, does not exist, in contrast to where the ANC government is in place.
All right, Keith, let me just come back to you for a second, because I'd like you to outline for myself as well as for our viewers what sort of policies are going to be laid out at this Congress during this week, and what policies, how different are they going to be from the past policies we've seen from the ANC?
Well, our point of departure is that the ANC is preparing itself to live for yet another 100 years. So at the heart of our policy review is a need for renewal of the party, but also to review all government policies with a view to accelerate service delivery in the country. We are looking at all policies, including economic policies, the judicial policies, social development policies, and education, and many other policies that are going to assist us in ensuring that we accelerate development and we continue on the path of improving the quality of life of South Africans, as we have done in the 18 years, which is, by the way, unprecedented in the continent in terms of the impact we have achieved in a very short period of time, given the fact that we've got a small revenue base in South Africa, given the levels of unemployment. And if you look at the record of service delivery, we have done quite well. But I also wanted to touch on the issue of the DA. That DA remains a white party that's pretending to be black. And all the claims they've made about successes they've scored, whether it's in the Western Cape, they inherited those systems from ANC. They just continuing where we left off. But also, in terms of issues like service delivery, unemployment, and job creation, people argue as if South Africa is immune from the structure of the world economy, where we've seen in Europe now, jobs being lost in America and so on. And when South Africa loses jobs, they make it sound like there's something fundamentally wrong in how South Africa has been run.
All right,
Whereas South Africa emerged as one of the countries that could withstand the economic tremors after the collapse of the world financial systems.
Okay, let me just allow Mmusi to respond to the comments you've made about the Democratic Alliance, and then I'll be asking you, Martin, about what you think of what Keith was just telling us and outlining to us about the policies that are going to be put forward and whether the voters will be convinced. But Mmusi, first, over to you.
Well, I think a recent study just proved the fact that 70% of British investment is actually channeled, focused towards the Western Cape due to the nature of the government that is in place. we've implemented a youth wage subsidy, which the ANC had proposed in 2010 and through its alliance partners then pulled away from it. Because through that process, we've been hiring more young people that have come on board. In fact, to suggest that in the Western Cape, the success is on the back of what the ANC did, quite frankly, the ANC has been out of power for quite an extensive amount of time. This is now our second term. So to then propose that is a bit of a fallacy. Furthermore, to talk about the diversification of our party, we must equally understand the fact that well within the ANC, when you look at the fact that they claim to represent the black majority, you can identify some of the challenges. You go to a province in Limpopo where textbooks are not being delivered in this country. You go to the Eastern Cape where in essence the services are at a dismal level. To then make that argument is a bit unfortunate when you contrast that with the service delivery levels that have been put in the Western Cape. To then furthermore suggest that we represent a particular interest is a bit unfair, because quite frankly we've seen that we found a process through which we can grow economically. We're finding models that allow us to use our ports more effectively in the Western Cape, and we're preparing to govern in a more strategic manner. To say that we are not inclined to say we want to win the national election in the next one. We want to win one or two more provinces to indicate quite clearly the fact that we have a governance model that proves us to be least corrupt and more effective at delivery of services.
Martin, over to you. And the policies that were outlined just a minute ago by Keith, are they enough to convince voters in the national election in South Africa?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that the thing is really that the ANC is now in a period of decline. And it needs to be in a period of decline because really South Africa needs a new government. All parties in government basically run out of ideas, run out of steam. It happens in Britain, it happens everywhere in the world. There's nothing special about South Africa. And the ANC basically, although it has a wonderful history of 100 years of struggle against apartheid, it really now needs to lose office. And the difficulty for South Africa is that transition process. Now, at the end of the 2007 Congress, you had one major breakaway from the ANC. I think after this one, we're likely to see another breakaway from the ANC. The Democratic Alliance may be the recipient of some of those supporters who will go and join them. And that is the biggest fear of the ANC, is that the DA genuinely will end being a white party and become a multiracial party, which it should become one day. The other thing is that there are now moves on the left within the trade union movement and wider in society to form another political party of the left. If that happens, you'll have greater diversity and the people of South Africa will have a greater opportunity to consider their options. And I think that would be then a very positive step for South Africa to take.
Keith, your response, and do you believe that the Democratic Alliance is on track to seize power from your party?
No, it will not. Actually, if you look at studies that were conducted, people, particularly the majority of South Africans, don't see DA as an alternative. Some may be happy about the ANC. They may be impatient because of our pace of delivery owing to limited resources, but they don't see DA as an alternative. There's been more consolidation of white support in the DA, which has pushed it up. If you look at the last local government elections, DA managed to gobble small parties, opposition parties that were around it, and the decline in the ANC, we can account for it because of the challenges we had in our own structures in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. The ANC will remain a strong party going into the future, and that's why during this conference we said we want this to be a watershed conference, and that will be determined by the policy positions that will come out with from this conference that will define the future of South Africa and the future of development in South Africa. And as to whether DA will be transformed, that's a big question. The jury is out. It doesn't look like, because if you look at the control in DA, they are doing well in terms of getting a few black faces to speak on behalf of the party.
All right.
But if you look at the party machinery behind the scenes in government at all levels where they are, it's still white male control.
We'll have to leave it there.
That is not going to do well in a society that subscribes to gender equality and non-racialism.
We'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much to all of my guests, Keith Khoza in Bloemfontein, Mmusi Maimane in Johannesburg, and Martin Plaut in London. Thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we thank our viewers for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can always send us your feedback. You can email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. From me and the whole team, goodbye for now.